Welcome to a new course on muscle and nerve cell physiology. Now, this is a subject that I'm learning at school, and as the famous physicist Richard Feynman once said, the best way to learn is to teach whatever you're learning. So that's what I'm doing, and that's what I have been doing. That's the idea for this channel, is to teach whatever I'm learning. And that helps me, also helps you. So, why did I pick this subject out of all the others? Because I'm studying a lot of things, not only this. I picked this subject because it's the most mathy one out of everything else, and you'll see why in a moment. So without further ado, let's start. Now, obviously, I hope you should know what muscle and nerve cells are. And physiology basically means how do things work. So, how do things work in the muscle and the nerve cells, right? How do they function? So that's what we're going to learn. The first part of the lecture series will focus more on the nerves, and then we'll do the muscles after that. So the first lecture will be just a general overview of the entire subject. So let's start with the nervous system. What does the nervous system actually do? Right? It's something that, something that allows you to accept or perceive information from the external world, and then it somehow processes that information, and then it generates a response. So we won't be dealing with the process part, because that's one of the secrets of nature, and you don't expect an 18-year-old to reveal the secrets of nature, right? You can't just ask that from me. You can't ask that from anyone, really. What we'll be interested in is how this information is perceived by our nervous system and how it's transported to the brain for processing, right? And we'll skip the processing part, and we'll say that the brain just automatically has a response. We don't know how, we don't know why, just has a response. And it sends that response over to, say, a muscle cell or some other cell to actually play out that response, right? So once the brain thinks of something to do, it should tell the other parts of the body to actually do that something. And that requires some sort of communication between the brain and the other parts of the body. And we'll understand how that communication happens, how that transfer of information happens, right? That's what we'll be looking at, the transfer of information. So, with that out of the way, let's just take a look at an example, right? So we have a piece of information, right? Let's say just food. Okay, we have food, and we have just a person, and they look at food, right? That's the information with our eyes. And somehow it is able to capture and perceive that information, and that information travels to the brain where processing happens, and then the brain generates a response. The response is move towards food. So the brain tells sort of the rest of the body to move towards the food. It gives that information to the muscle cells to contract in a certain way that allows for movement. This arrow over here, which indicates the transfer of information from the eyes to the brain, it is known as the afferent pathway, whereas the movement of information from the brain to the rest of the body to generate a response, this arrow over here, is known as the efferent pathway. So it's just basically the pathway that the information takes, and this is the pathway that the response takes. Now let's focus on the afferent pathway first. So the afferent pathway is the pathway that the information takes to go to the brain. So in this case, the information is first perceived by the eye, and then it somehow has to reach the brain. And, well, how does that happen? Well, there's a nerve, and it's called a sensory nerve. Sensory nerves are responsible for mediating the transfer of information in the afferent pathway. Typically, what a nerve looks like, the images that you'll see or the images that you're familiar with will be something like, I'm not the best drawer, so forgive me for this horrendous drawing of a nerve. So this is what you'll typically see. This is the main body of the nerve. These are the dendrites at the back over here, and this is the axon, and this is the axon terminal. Don't worry if you're not familiar with these words. It's just, we'll get to them. It's just for people that are already familiar. Perhaps this typical example that you're familiar with is not what all nerve cells look like. There are many different types of nerve cells, and this is just one of them. This specifically is the structure of a motor neuron. So a motor neuron is what is responsible for the efferent pathway, the transfer of information in the efferent pathway. And it has a structure like this. So that's just something to keep in mind. The sensory neuron, what it looks like is basically there's a cell body in the middle and just axons which extend in both directions. So this part over here, it will be responsible for obtaining the information, and this part over here is sort of the part that is responsible for transferring that information to the brain. And then we have this highway over here so that the information can get from one end to the other end. So we have an axon that extends in both directions, to the left and to the right, although the information just flows in one way. But this structure, as you can see, is significantly different to that of a motor neuron. So a motor neuron is responsible for brain to muscle. So after the brain has decided on a response, so you have the dendrites over here, which is responsible for sort of obtaining the orders from the brain on what to do. And we have the axon over here, which is responsible for transmitting that data across our body, and it reaches the axon terminal over here where it sort of interfaces with the muscle. Here some interaction happens, and that interaction governs what the muscle should actually do. So our main goal for the first few videos, or like the first part of this series, is to explain how exactly this information travels in the axon, right? But before we get to that, we need to do a bit of preliminary work first. So to understand how the information travels, we should also first understand, more importantly, what is that information, right? In cables, for example, in your computer or whatever, the information that's being sent is basically ones and zeros, signals which are either off or on, and the frequency of that off and on signal, and also the sequence of off and on itself, is the information that is perceived by the computer and that is sort of processed by the computer to generate meaningful information. So over here, we're not transmitting ones and zeros, right? What we're actually transferring is electricity. Now, we need to elaborate on that a bit, right? We can't just say electricity and just leave it at that, right? So, to understand this in more detail, we need to define a few terms. right? We're going to define what an action potential is. So an action potential is a sudden change in membrane potential. Now I know that definition is not too useful, but we'll define what membrane potential is soon. Membrane potential refers basically to the difference in the charges between the intercellular environment of the cell and the extracellular environment of the cell. So this is a very similar concept to the voltage, right? A voltage is a difference in electrical potential between two different points. So some of you who are familiar with physics will be able to understand that. This is a similar concept, and the membrane potential is in fact measured in voltage as well. Just because the two concepts are similar, they can be linked to one another. Let me just give you an example in case you're still struggling. So let's say we have a cell, and we have the intracellular environment, which is over here, and we have the extracellular environment, which is everything outside. These two environments are separated by the plasma membrane. I hope you have an understanding of what that is. If you do, then good. You will understand that the plasma membrane is semi-permeable. It means that some objects can pass through, some objects cannot pass through. And that means that the composition of the fluid inside of the cell is ultimately going to be different than the fluid composition outside of the cell. So let's say, for example, that the inside of the cell has a bunch of sodium ions and the outside of the cell has a bunch of chlorine ions. This means that the inside of the cell is a lot more positive than the outside of the cell. And so that results in a membrane potential, a high membrane potential. And that's because the difference between the intracellular and extracellular environment, the charges in the intracellular and extracellular environment, is pretty different, right? One of them is positive, the other one is negative. The membrane, the plasma membrane over here, plays an important role, because without the plasma membrane, what could happen is, for example, the chlorine could go in, or the sodium could go out, and they could balance each other's charges. And so there would be no difference between the intracellular and extracellular environment. So the barrier property of the plasma membrane is important in maintaining a membrane potential. So that's sort of the idea behind membrane potential. So I'm just gonna right now just give a formula that describes that idea. So the membrane potential, MP, is basically the charge. I'm just going to give charge with a hashtag symbol. So the charge inside of the cell, it's minus by the charge outside of the cell. And that represents the idea of what a membrane potential actually is. It's not actually calculated this way, right? There won't be any calculations involved or questions involving calculations of this sort. This is just a formula that explains the idea of what a membrane potential is supposed to represent. So as you can see from this formula over here, if the charge inside of the cell increases, then that leads to an increase in the membrane potential. And if the charge in the inside of the cell decreases, then that leads to a decrease in the membrane potential. That is clear from the formula over here. So let's say you inject sodium ions into the cell, what you would expect is an increase in the readings of your membrane potential. Let's say that the membrane potential is greater than 0. What does that mean? So we have 0 and membrane potential is greater than 0. What does that mean? Well, we can add charge outside of the cell on both sides, and we would get that the charge outside of the cell is less than the charge inside of the cell. So a membrane potential that is greater than 0 means that the inside of the cell is more positive than the outside of the cell, right? So similarly, if the membrane potential is, I'm just going to write MP greater than 0. So similarly, if the membrane potential is less than 0, what this means is that the inside of the cell is more negative than the outside of the cell. So if you take a nerve cell and you measure its membrane potential, how that's done, by the way, is similar to how a voltmeter is actually set up. So you have a sort of probe or an electrode over here, and there's like this voltmeter, and then you have another one that's connecting outside of the cell, and the reading over here will measure the difference, the electrical charge differences between what's inside and what's outside of the cell. Right, where were we? So yeah, if you actually do perform that measurement, what you would get is negative 70 millivolts. So the inside of the cell is more negative than the outside of the cell. So I hope that you have a sufficient understanding of what a membrane potential actually is now, which means that an action potential should be easy to grasp and understand. It's a sudden change in membrane potential. So if, for example, you measure a nerve cell, it gives a result of negative 70 millivolts, and something happens, and suddenly the membrane potential jumps into 100 millivolts, then we would say that an action potential has been generated, right? A sudden change in the membrane potential has occurred, right? And this is the information that we're trying to transmit, right? When a nerve cell, specifically a sensory nerve cell, receives information, it generates an action potential, right? The receiving of information triggers the inside of the cell to be more positive. I should clear up a misunderstanding before we continue. So when I say it makes the cell become more positive, that doesn't really apply to nerve cells because nerve cells are super huge. So that change in membrane potential, otherwise known as the action potential, will only be apparent at this specific area, not the rest of the nerve cell. Like, for example, this area is still negative 70, this area is still negative 70, but this area over here is 100. So let's draw this at a much bigger scale, yeah? So we have one part of the neuron being more positive than the other parts of the neuron. So let's say there's just a bunch of positive charge just localized in one area, while the rest is not as positive. So our question is, how does the action potential, this change in membrane potential here, suddenly to 100, how does that get transferred along the axon so that every other part also becomes 100 as well, right? You might think that the answer to that is simple diffusion, right? Particles that are in high concentration will move to an area with lower concentration. So the sodium ions or whatever is causing the positive charge will just diffuse and everything will be fine. But that does not really help, because let's say we have 100 over here, this is negative 70, then the final result will probably just be like 10, 10 as the positive charge spreads out, right? And this is just moving from like one area to this area, right? If you go from here to here, you'll have to spread the positive charge even thinner, right? You'll have another area over here, which is negative 70, and then the sodium ions over here will have to spread apart to this region, and you'll get like 2, 2, 2 or something like that after it spreads out and thins out a bit more. So diffusion is not very effective at transferring this action potential, because eventually the positive signal will just die out, right? So what actually happens? What mechanism has evolution invented in order to overcome this problem? Well, the answer to that, unfortunately, will not be in this video because I've spoken for too long already, and it also won't be in the next couple of videos because we still need to do like a lot more preliminary work to actually understand what is happening. So you'll have to be a bit patient. But I hope I've introduced enough and piqued a bit of interest into this problem of how of the positive charge on one side goes to the other side. And I encourage you to think about it in your own time as you wait for the next video to release. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching and see you next video.